Welcome to Fear Street.
Hey there, welcome to Fear Street. I'm Jackula, and I'll be your host for the evening. Fear is a very powerful force that affects all of us to some degree. Some of us have been so traumatized from such a young age that fear is a major player in our lives. It becomes so dominant that it perverts the imagination into a grotesque monster, a beast, that we can never have peace until we face it. But what happens once we do? Do we slay this beast, or does it slay us? Find out tonight on Fear Street, where nightmares come alive.
A wise man once told me that beyond our little physical existence, there exists a force, a presence, if you will. This presence is aware of everything, because that's what it is, pure awareness. It also has a nature, and forgive me for sounding corny here, but that nature is love. And we walk down a certain path, the path that we somehow know is right for us, towards expansion and a more meaningful life. This presence joins forces with us and creates something that can only be described as grace. We've all experienced it. The perfect timing, the seeming coincidences that somehow led you exactly to where you never knew you always needed to be. That's grace. But if there's this loving presence, then there's also got to be an opposite. I mean, think about it. There's up and there's down. There's left and there's right. Sun and moon. Day and night. Summer and winter. Man and woman. Life and death. And so on. And if this presence nature is the opposite of love, then it must be hate. Fear is really the best way I can describe it. We've all felt this presence too. It's the sudden feeling you get when you're all alone, and suddenly all the hairs on your body stand up. Dread overcomes you, and you feel death itself, breathing down your neck. It's as mysterious as the deepest depths of the ocean. But one thing is for certain, this force is pure evil. Growing up, I was all too familiar with this force. My parents didn't want me, or so I assume, so my mother left me in a garbage can. I was found in a park in Brooklyn in mid-January, nearly frozen to death. That day, the first day of my life, I became an orphan. That's when I was introduced to that force, and it would color my young life for years to come. I'd love to say I was adopted by loving parents and lived happily ever after, but as you can probably guess, that wasn't the case at all. I bounced around from foster home to foster home, back to the orphanage, more times than I care to remember. It left me feeling like I didn't matter, like I was invisible. I wasn't able to make many friends, and when I did, I'd always inevitably get ripped away from them. So I created my own imaginary world, a world where I mattered, where people cared about me. At first it was great. I finally had the sense of belonging that I've been looking for my entire life. But as the years went by and I got older, life seemed harder. I saw poverty and crime all around me, and I accepted it as a reality. But somewhere deep down, I knew I was being mistreated. I knew that some people, normal people as I called them, were born with parents. I wanted to be normal so bad, but I couldn't. I envied normal people. But somewhere along the way, that envy started to fester. It started to rot my soul, turn into rage and hate. I hated my parents for abandoning me. I hated the system for failing me. I hated society for ignoring me. Over time, my imaginary world went from a happy place I could escape to a dark abyss that consumed me. At first, I could hide it, but eventually started spilling over into the real world more and more. I started seeing things differently, doing things that I'd never do. Petty crime became the norm for me. The worst part of it all, though, were the hallucinations. Imagination is one thing. You know it's in your mind. But hallucinations are different. They cross over into reality. And at times, you can't tell the difference. The things I was seeing were pretty out there sometimes. But mostly they were people, at first. After a while, they became much more like monsters. And they were talking to me constantly, filling me with hatred. I know now that they were really manifestations of massive amounts of suppressed rage, or at least that's what the shrink told me. They were always reminding me of all the horrible things I'd suffered, torturing me, telling me to do horrible things, evil things. To ignore them took every ounce of strength I had, but they were relentless. And after months of sadistic torture, I could feel my sanity start to slip. I was just so tired. I couldn't fight it anymore. And I let them in. I was playing hoops with this kid Benny, who I didn't like very much to begin with. He was a rough kid and was fouling me left and right. Now usually I wouldn't have minded much, but by this time, around 14, I was barely hanging on by a thread. I went up for a jumper, and Benny fouled the hell out of me. Put his hand in my face, held my arm, and knocked me down. This is gonna sound crazy, but I swear it's true. A man who I'd never seen handed me the ball and told me to hit Benny with it. I didn't even think about it. I just got up and clocked him as hard as I could, clean in the face. The blood had already started rushing from his nose before I cocked back to follow up. Now, I didn't intend to keep hitting him, but by the time they pulled me off, the lactic acid burn was so strong, I couldn't lift my arms. Benny was unconscious, his face barely visible through all the blood. His nose, orbital bones in both eyes and jaw were all broken. He nearly choked to death on his own blood. I watched everything unfold from a bird's eye view. Benny struggling to breathe, the paramedics arriving, the cuffs being placed around my wrists. The craziest thing, though, is I don't remember it at all. I completely blacked out. I was in a cell for 3 months before they gave me a psychiatric evaluation and declared me a bipolar schizophrenic. Soon after, they transferred me to a nut house, a mental institution if you prefer. They put me on a bunch of meds, which I have to admit did make things more manageable, but I hated taking all those pills. Not just because of the inconvenience, but because, how can I explain this? Okay, so the pills took away my hallucinations and quieted the voices for the most part, but they also took away me, my soul, my personality. I became a shell of my former self. Anyway, after 6 months, I got out of there. Then I was right back into the system, foster care, group home, and back and forth, over and over. I was 16 by this point, and just tired. Tired of feeling like a zombie. Tired of bouncing around. Tired of pretending everything was all peaches and cream. Tired of being someone else. I knew the risk involved, but I stopped taking my medicine. And shortly after, by some stroke of luck, I was adopted by the greatest people in the world. They had experience with troubled kids like me, having adopted 3 times before. They were tough on me, which is exactly what I needed. I didn't understand why at first, but eventually I realized it was because they actually cared. It was the first time in my life anyone had cared enough about me to take an interest in what I was doing, or talk to me about the things I was going through. They pushed me in school and in life, to the point that I stopped doing anything that wasn't legal and became a straight A student. Eventually the hallucinations just stopped, and I started to feel almost normal. I could hardly believe it when I got into college, or when I met and fell in love with the girl I ended up marrying. When I graduated, landed my dream job working with kids who grew up like me, and bought my first home, pinching myself became a daily practice, because I knew I had to be dreaming. Everything was going so well that I didn't see it coming. It was a cozy Saturday evening in the fall. My wife was out shopping, and I was home alone watching 80s action movies, which are my favorite. My wife hates them, so anytime I get the chance to watch something by myself, it's always those. I heard what sounded like a bowl fall onto the floor in the kitchen. I was thinking, that's strange because I had just done the dishes earlier, and everything was put up. So I went to investigate. My kitchen has two entrances. One is from the living room, and the other's from a hall on the other side. I entered the kitchen from the living room side, and saw that sure enough, a bowl had fallen to the floor. I figured I must have left it out and forgotten about it. No big deal. But I had this weird feeling that I wasn't alone. The hall by the other side of the kitchen was dark, and it's hard to describe, but I just had this feeling, like a force pulling me to go there. So I walked into the hall and looked to the right, and as I did, I could see someone walking past the doorway at the end of the hall. But it was only a glimpse. Like, you know when you barely catch someone walking around a corner, you may only see a piece of the back of their shirt? It was like that, except all I saw was a piece of a shadow. I could instantly feel my palms break out in a cold sweat, the hairs on my arms stand up, and a deep pit form in my stomach. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but I calmed myself down slightly by telling myself that maybe I'd imagined it. As scared as I was, I knew I had to go check it out. I took as deep a breath as I could, which wasn't very deep by the way, and mustered the courage to go and have a look. Though I intended to puff my chest out and go in there with an air of bravery, I found my feet inching forward slowly, one after the other. I planned what I'd do when I saw the robber, if he or they had weapons versus if they didn't. Finally, I reached the doorway and looked to the left. In the darkness, I saw nothing at first, but upon close examination, I noticed something. Across the room, deep in the darkness, I could just barely make out a shadow. It seemed to just be standing there. It was dead still, not even breathing. I stared at it, transfixed, but terrified. Then, it's not easy trying to explain this, but it melted away into the darkness. I reached for the light switch, but I was too late. Whatever it was gone. I started racking my brain about what could have happened, but I kept drawing a blank. With no other logical explanation, I convinced myself that my imagination must have gotten the best of me. 2 weeks later, I woke up in the middle of the night to take a leak. I never turn on the bathroom light when I wake up in the middle of the night because it disturbs my wife and makes me take longer to get back to sleep. So with the exception of a little light coming from some electronics, it was almost pitch black. After I finished up, I flushed the toilet and turned around. There was someone right behind me. I reached for the light switch, and with a flick, light drowned out the darkness. But whoever I'd seen was gone. I'd never been startled so much in my life. I stood there for a while, trying to slow my heart rate, which probably took me 10 minutes. The next day in the shower, I could swear the curtain kept jerking inwards, as if someone was hitting it from the outside. Only, no one was there. I didn't think much of it, or connect it to the prior events at the time. And then, nothing. Nothing out of the ordinary, at least. Not for weeks. It was a Monday, and I was on the road headed to work. My mind was off somewhere else, but it jolted back when I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. It was the most heinous and vile-looking thing I've ever seen, and that's saying a lot. Without realizing it, I'd pulled the steering wheel hard, and the next thing I knew, I'd swerved off the road at 45 miles an hour and ended up upside down in a ditch. I don't remember anything after swerving off the road though, but apparently I hit my head and was knocked unconscious on impact. I'd gotten a concussion and a bruised rib cage. When I awoke, I was in a hospital bed with a hell of a headache and my wife by my side. I could tell how worried she was by the tone of her voice, but she played it off well when she greeted me. That quickly came to an end though, when I asked how she was doing. It wasn't long before she broke down, so I did my best to console her. It was then that I realized just how much I'd scared her, and that's when I knew I had to tell her what was up. I left no stone unturned, telling her everything, from that first event in our kitchen to what had happened on my way to work. Knowing about my childhood, of course she figured I was seeing things that weren't really there. So she asked me if I thought I should get back on my medication. I honestly didn't know, but I knew I didn't want to, and that's exactly what I told her. She supported my decision for the time being, but I could tell she just didn't understand it. I guess she figured being on medication couldn't be any worse than what I was going through now. I don't blame her, but it was worse. Have you ever woken up after a crazy night of partying and not felt like yourself? Well, imagine feeling like that over and over, all day, every day. When I got back home, I could tell she was still worried, so I did my best to ease her mind, and almost straight away, things pretty much seemed to go right back to normal. I was back at work and hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary for a while. It was a Saturday, about a month and a half after I'd gotten out of the hospital. My wife and I had had a date night, dinner and seeing one of our favorite artists in concert. The night had ended well, if you know what I mean, and she'd fallen asleep with her head on my chest. In the middle of the night, suddenly I was awakened. When I opened my eyes, even though it was dark, I was drawn to look toward the far corner of the room. As my vision began to hone in on more detail, I started to make out the shape of what I was seeing. Suddenly, I realized there was someone there, in the dark with us. My heart began pounding as I laid there motionless, staring at it, and it was staring right back at me too. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its presence locked on mine. It felt like pure evil. I gasped audibly, which woke up my wife, who asked what was wrong. I pointed to the creature, but as she turned her head to look, it melted away into the darkness. She looked back at me, bewildered and awaiting an explanation. I thought I saw something, babe. Sorry I woke you. We drifted back off to sleep, which took her all of 30 seconds, while I laid awake trying for another hour at least, before finally drifting off. Things were definitely a little weird between my wife and I the following morning. When I was leaving for work, she gave me the look she gives anytime she's really worried, though in all fairness, she did try to play it off. But what could I do? I was having an uneventful day at work and took my usual lunch break at 12:45. Nature called, so I went to the restroom and was standing at the mirror washing my hands, when all of a sudden, my reflection changed its expression. I know this sounds crazy, but it began to look ominous. Remember that force I was talking about earlier? Evil? That's the vibe it was giving me. The facial expression didn't match mine at all. I thought, I have to be imagining this, and leaned in closer to the mirror, which my reflection reciprocated, but its expression still didn't match mine. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the mirror and grabbed me by the throat. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't break free. I could hear my heartbeat growing louder in my ears, and everything started to fade out. Then, the bathroom door swung open, and the hand retreated back into the mirror. I struggled to catch my breath as the stranger who'd just come in gave me a nod and a smile before heading into the stall on the far end of the restroom. For the rest of the workday, I was like a ghost, dead physically, but completely gone mentally. I had no idea what was going on, and I was starting to think I'd finally gone crazy. Things weren't so great with my wife either. She thought I was losing my mind. Not that she said it, but I could tell it's how she felt. Honestly though, I couldn't blame her. Hell, I couldn't even disagree with her. Surprisingly though, I was able to hold it together enough to maintain equilibrium. My marriage wasn't great, but it was holding on. Work wasn't great either, but somehow I managed to avoid getting fired. Things went on like that for weeks, and I had no idea when or if it would end. One night, I was awoken by someone knocking at my front door. I looked over at the clock on my nightstand and saw that it was 2 a.m. I never had visitors this late, so I knew it had to be someone uninvited. I slowly made my way to the front door and looked through the peephole to see that there was no one there. I opened the door and looked in all directions, but still didn't see anyone. So I went back inside and got back into bed. After a few minutes, I was drifting back to sleep when I heard another knock. This time it sounded like it was coming from the hallway right outside my bedroom. There wasn't a single part of me that wanted to investigate it, but because of the possibility of it being an intruder, I knew I had to. I inched out of bed as slow and quiet as I could so I wouldn't wake Stacy, and headed for my bedroom door, poking my head out into the hallway. As soon as I did that, the knocking stopped. There didn't appear to be anyone in the hall, other than me. But there was a hallway closet, and I had a feeling that whoever had been knocking on my wall was in there. So I walked over to it, only to freeze in fear once I put my hand on the doorknob. I took a deep breath, threw my shoulders back, and slung the door open. There was nothing out of the ordinary, and certainly no one in there. But suddenly, I felt a chill in my bones, and a presence come up behind me. It felt as if someone with a strong negative presence had just walked up, right there. I turned around and couldn't believe my eyes. It looked like a translucent dark figure, staring right back at me. In a flash, it put its hand around my throat again, and began squeezing the life out of me. I struggled to get away, but just like before, it was no use. I began losing consciousness, but for a brief moment, I looked right into its eyes, and I saw my own. Suddenly, Stacy called to me, and it was gone. I fell to the floor with a thud, coughing violently, and Stacy came running over to me. She asked what had happened, and honestly, I knew I should make something up, but the truth came out before I could stop myself from saying it. I told her exactly what had happened, and I don't know what kind of reaction I'd expected, but the look she gave me told me more than words ever could. She thought I'd completely lost it. The next day, she was sitting on the couch when I woke up, wanting to talk. I knew what she was going to say before she uttered a word, and it was the last thing I wanted to talk about. She asked me to get back on medication, a proposal which I refused. I told her I'd be fine, but I knew she wasn't buying it. We argued back and forth until I had to leave for work, which is something we'd never done before. Anyone that knows me knows I won't even go to bed in a fight with my wife. I always try to make things right first. But this time there was nothing I could say. Her mind was made up, but so was mine. Even her tears weren't enough to change that. The next several days, I won't lie to you, home life sucked. Me and Stacy were rarely in the same room, and when we were, there was the painfully awkward, obligatory hi forced small talk to cover up the obvious, followed by us retreating to separate ends of the house as quickly as possible. One night, I dozed off on the couch, which is where I'd been sleeping every night since the incident, and was awoken by a cold wind on my face. When I opened my eyes, I saw the same shadowy figure I'd seen before, standing right in front of me. As I stared at it, it began to solidify. Features started to form, and they looked just like my own. This continued until it completely solidified. It was looking right at me, with a look that would have killed me without a doubt, if looks could kill, that is. I stared into its eyes, and it stared into mine for what seemed like an eternity, and suddenly, it became crystal clear to me. I reached out toward it as I slowly stood up, putting my hand on its shoulder. Its face twisted into an even more enraged state, and though I was shaking, I wrapped my arms around it, hugging it tightly and softly, repeating "I'm sorry" and "I love you" in its ear. Tears began to flow down my cheeks for the first time since I was little, and I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I felt my doppelganger's muscles relax, and then he was gone. I sat there crying for what must have been an hour, letting go of all the hatred I'd let build up inside me for all those years, and eventually fell asleep. The next morning I knew my ordeal was over, and I apologized to Stacy. We're doing much better. Holding on to anger and trauma is a slow-killing poison. It may not catch up to you today, but rest assured it will find you, no matter how far you run.